the fire exit signs to evacuate the building. And having done that formal bit, let's get down to business. The observant amongst you will notice that I'm not Linda Queener. We knew she had a really sore throat yesterday, and I suspect she may struggle through, but she hasn't turned up yet. So I'm Joe Wilson from the Scottish Qualifications Authority, where I'm head of new ventures, and I'm just going to start off some of the thinking that I think we need to get going today. First of all, I'm a member of the Association for Learning Technology, and this is one of their SIG groups that has organised this event today. You'll hear a bit more about ALT in a minute or two, but always very grateful for ALT providing a lever and a neutral kind of space for us to move in to discuss things that actually affect us beyond institutional or, in my case, beyond non-departmental public body land, the kind of open space that we actually need to think in often to move things forward. We've got a day today that really looks at all things open. Why is it a good time to look at all things open? Well, if I look across the sectors that I'm engaged with, if we look at schools across Scotland, still coming through a major and innovative curricular reform called Curriculum for Excellence. At the sharp end, as we speak, and some of you will be aware, there's lots of noise and chattering around the first rollout of the new National 4 and National 5 qualifications. Next year, new hires. We're about to do reformed advanced hires as well. With all of that all going on, it's a very good time to have another look at how we all work together to help our colleagues who teach in schools, to support them with learning materials and resources, and really have a think again about who's at the centre of all of this, which is the learner. It's all about the learner and lifelong learning. It's not about these barriers that we create around what happens in schools or what happens in further education, or gosh, only universities and higher education do that, or that's nothing to do with us, that's community learning. In fact, the learner's at the heart of all of this. And if we get it right, and we use technology wisely, and we have an open and sharing culture, then we can actually do a whole lot more for our learners. The same too if you look at college space. If you look at college space just now, colleges are just coming through and I'm on the board of a college, so I'll use this word advisedly, quite a brutal period of reform and regionalisation, where, with all the best will in the world, a lot of the efforts are all focused on due diligence around regionalisation, of restructuring and all of these kind of things. And there's a danger in that too, that we lose a focus on the learner and lifelong learning, that we're too busy worrying about restructuring and doing all these things. We don't take time to think about how we might share things, how shared services might be in the future, how we should be working together. Universities too in Scotland, I think, probably are in the most privileged position. And I use that word advisedly too. I think we're very lucky to have a government that supports the principle of free higher education. But I think there's a quid pro quo in that too. I think if higher education is free, what else can universities do to support lifelong learning in the college space and the school space? And I think too, if you look at the coverage just in the last week, particularly from down south, about students who are now paying customers beginning to complain to ombudsman and various other things about the service culture in higher education. We shouldn't be asleep at the wheel about that fundamental relationship between institutions and learners is changing. And it's changing above all because actually learners don't have to come to any of our institutions anymore to learn. If they're self-actualised learners, there's lots of learning there already. Be it the car mechanic learning how to fix things by having a look at YouTube, through to the investment analyst busy doing a MOOC from Stanford. You know, there is a bit in all of this where all of us and our institutions have to reevaluate how we are supporting learners. And the best way to do it, I believe, is through much greater openness and much greater sharing of things. So things that I think ought to have happened by now, but aren't there. You know, things like where are the communities of practice of, let's look at some of the hot spots in the system. Everybody always complains that schools or colleges don't get the teaching of maths or the teaching of computational thought. Well, where are the communities of practice or the shared materials or these things cascading round the system? Particularly from the big seats of learning, where a lot of these rocks often fly out from, you know, usually straight into the Scotsman or the Herald, saying that, you know, that somehow teachers can't do this or somebody. Wouldn't it be good if that noise stopped and rather than criticism, learning materials and resources flowed out around the system? Because that would help rather than just be noise. Where are we in terms of looking at new models of assessment? You know, if we've got learners moving through schools and colleges and on into universities, how are we enabling a learner to take their portfolio of learning with them? Not just the paper certificates that SQA give people, or that scroll that universities give people. What employers want to see is they want to see that rich collection of things that differentiate us as people and differentiate us as learners. And we need e-portfolios that follow the student, that aren't things that get switched off after the student's left. There's lots of evidence in the college space that there's good stuff happening around e-portfolios and things, but when the student goes back to get the stuff a year later, because they're not a student anymore, so all of that's been deleted and chucked out for the next student. You know, there are clever cloud services, some of which are free, that we should be thinking about using across the system. Where do things like open badges and new kinds of credentialing sit in amongst all of this too? And beyond formal education, the people that we all touch directly, how can we help community learning and learning? And one of the big challenges we've got in the system is digital participation. You know, a learner or even a citizen without a browser now is at a distinct disadvantage. They can't engage with civil society. They can't actually claim DWP benefits and things like that because as government services move to digital by default, we're not empowering these people. So again, how can we open up resources to support the voluntary agencies and all of these folk who are out in the front line in communities, trying to get communities switched on and motivated and turning these folk not into alienated subgroups, but turning them into lifelong learners and empowering them. So we won't manage all of that today, but what we've got today really is a programme looking at all of these kind of open things. Some of you might be, somebody asked who comes along to these kind of events. In the audience, you're a mixture of school people, mainly higher education people and some further education people. And a lot of folk that one way or another have got, you might not always appreciate it because the tiller's sometimes quite small, but some of you have also got the hands on some of the controls that can make some of this open stuff really happen if we just keep pushing a bit. And this open stuff isn't just happening here, it's happening all around all around the world. And I'll shut up at that, but hopefully that's got you beginning to think. You'll see the programme, and I'll introduce folk as they come up. And really now I'd like to introduce Maren Deepole, who'll do a wee bit about what ALT is.
Thank you very much, Joe, and hello everybody. I always get the privilege to be the first one to talk at this event that I think this is the third time I've come along, to tell you a little bit about what we're up to and what we're hoping to work on with you. But before I talk to you a little bit about what the association does, what we do with our membership, I wanted to share a more kind of personal reflection, because I think the first time I came to the ALT Scotland SIG was in 2012 at Glasgow Caledonian University, and Linda hosted us, and I think some of you were there as well. I can definitely see familiar faces. But there were maybe 25 of us at most, and we were talking about how we could make this group, the ALT Scotland Special Interest Group, really flourish, how we could, as a group of members of the association, grow in influence, how we could become more involved in policy development, how we could become more involved with schools, with colleges, not just with universities, and how we could really make an impact. And I'm really proud that 2 years on, we are now here in the Informatics Forum in Edinburgh, and not only has the size of this group really grown, but also with support from the JISC RSC and from SQA, we've been able to put together a very exciting programme. Gone are the days where there was a few of us and we were sharing a bit more informal updates, but I'm really excited about the amount of engagement this group's been able to pull together. And I'm aware that there might be other ALT members who are not in Scotland watching this online, but I think it's fair to say that this is one of our most active, most influential special interest groups. And I'm really proud that as an association, we have such active membership in Scotland. Now, over the past 2 years, we've also come to a sort of watershed milestone for ALT itself, in that we published a new shared vision for the future in the beginning of this year, in February, in a new ALT strategy. And I'm sure you will get this presentation afterwards, so hopefully you can click on the links and see what I'm talking about. But one of the key issues in the new strategy that we've really set out is to work more with policymakers, more with government, to try and really convey the voice of our members. And I'm hoping that some of what we'll hear today will help inform policy here in Scotland, but also more widely. And we've also had a real emphasis on growth internationally, and also collaboration internationally. And I think that's one of the really important role that the special interest groups have played in really helping provide geographically bound or topic bound focuses for engagement for people to kind of build those supportive networks that Joe was talking about, trying to really build mechanisms by which people can share resources, can share ideas, but can also be honest about what doesn't work and what we need to work on. But also, not everything we care about is digital, and I was in Glasgow only a few weeks ago to see Joe and Sarah Cornelius and Linda Greener, the co-chairs of our conference this year, and I didn't take the opportunity to go and see the School of Art. I didn't get to see the library. I've never actually been there. I'm hoping some of you will have been more fortunate than me. But one of the things, apart from being personally a library fanatic, that this news story, the strategy really made me think about is that not everything in digital, not everything in learning technology is digital. And there's many things we care about. And what we care about most is obviously people, but also things that we create together. So I thought in this presentation I wanted to talk to you a lot about some of the member-led things that our association currently does and that we're able to do. And one of the areas where we've been really active over the last year or two is our MOOC special interest groups, and some of you are involved in that, I know, and also an upcoming event that's running in June on MOOCs, where we ran a conference at Southampton last year. And there's also the Open Education Special Interest Group, and they run the OER conference. And I'm hoping very much that maybe in 2016 that conference will be in Scotland. I think 2015 will be in Wales. So it's a really exciting space where we're very active internationally. And also I'm joining the Open Policy Network, which I think is something we're very much looking into, both as an association and as a special interest group. A really interesting international collaboration, very much committed to learning, teaching and assessment in the open. But also I think we're trying hard, and I think this is a good example today, this event, collaborating with partners, including JISC and the Association of Colleges and a lot of other sector bodies, both specifically in specific regions and countries, but also internationally. I'm sorry. I hope that wasn't my fault, but okay. One of the things I'm most interested in finding out more about today, and I think we're all hoping that you'll be able to join a lively debate, is the policy and the Scottish Open Education Declaration. We've been, I think, getting some comments already, and there's obviously a declaration on the internet you can look at, but I'm very curious to see if this is a model that could be shaping some of the work on open education, and particularly declarations and commitments to that in other areas of the work we do. So I'm extremely interested in that in particular in the debate this afternoon. But one of the things I think that my role is in particular today is also, as we work in other areas of policy development, with government particularly on the Further Education Learning Technology Action Group, and the now broader Education Technology Action Group, one of the things I'm very passionate about is helping us learn in forums like today's meeting and translating that back into other policy contexts. Because there is certainly a lot we can learn from the work we do here with you in Scotland and try and apply that in other areas. So that is one of the things I in particular want to take back. But I also want to talk a little bit about some upcoming things, and I'm aware that Joe and Sarah and Linda, as co-chairs of this year's conference, are all very excited about September and our upcoming event. We have a special focus on openness this year, and I very much hope that some of you will be able to join us. I'm afraid it is not in Scotland. We tried, but the term dates didn't work out, so unfortunately it's going to be in Warwick. But we hope some of you will make the journey and join us for that. I think we found in particular, with a focus on FE as well in the conference, that it's becoming more and more broad as a forum for exchange of ideas, and we're hoping to have a strong Scottish presence at our event this year. But I also want to make you aware of another activity which we're involved in, which is coming up, which is a special issue for the journal that ALT publishes, Research and Learning Technology. And one of the things we tried to do is to think of a topic that would let us put into practice some of our aims for international collaboration and collaboration across different areas. So we're planning a special issue together with the Sloan Consortium, who are based in the US, the Irish Learning Technology Association, with whom ALT recently signed a new Memorandum of Understanding, and Askelaid, based in Australasia. And what we're hoping to do is, with guest editors from each of the associations, including ourselves, is to actually put a special issue out which is all about collaboration internationally and across borders. We're hoping to focus on particularly open initiatives that help us as technology becomes more and more global, and the tech companies that develop a lot of the services that we use on a daily basis operate more and more globally. We're hoping to try and contribute to a debate that shows how some things can work very easily with technology and how some things can maybe still be improved on, areas we can work on. And I can tell you that scheduling a telephone conference, even for 4 people in 4 different time zones, should be its article in itself, because I think we didn't think about that before we put the special issue together. But last and not least, many of you, and I think Linda is now here and will hopefully not blush too much as she's the lead tutor for this week. Hello, Linda. Many of you have been involved in our open course in technology enhanced learning, and I'm rather least qualified of many people in this room to talk about that. I think Martin Hawksey is certainly more qualified, and so would Linda be and many of the other tutors. But it's one of the most fun and exciting things we've done in a long time. It's an open course. This year we've had over 1,000 registered participants, and we've started experimenting with open badges so that people can earn open badges as part of the course. Hundreds of those have been issued. And also, this course is entirely designed and run by ALT members, as we haven't had any funding to run this course at all. And it's a really great example, I think, of how much positive willingness there is amongst our community to help others, to share, to do what Joe was talking about earlier, to really just not say, oh well, this doesn't work, or there is a problem, we should do this, but to say, look, here are some resources, some ideas, some ways of thinking that I found useful, that you might find helpful too. And it's been absolutely fantastic to see the breadth of people who are engaging with the course, and I think it very much shows what we try and do. It embodies some of our values really strongly. Last year when we ran the course, it was mainly focused on AG practitioners because of the way it was funded, but this year we've opened it out to practitioners across all educational sectors. And it was absolutely fantastic to see that over 25% of participants are not from AG. There is practitioners from FE, I think over 220. There are schools practitioners, people from the commercial sector, private learning, lifelong learning, adult learning, offender learning. It's really exciting to see. And people from lots of different countries, which makes it all a much more international endeavor. I'm hoping very much that this is an example of something that we can work on in the future, a sort of, it's an entirely different business model for a MOOC or an open online course, as it doesn't generate any income and it's all done with your work, your time, our members' expertise and voluntary effort. And I think that's a really wonderful development that we're hoping to build on in the future, hoping to maybe extend our use of badges and hopefully be able to help with professional development and the recognition of what learning technologists and others who have learning technology as part of their work with on a daily basis. So, last, what's next? So what's coming up? We're very interested in working with
Really, without further ado, and starting from the top with that sort of where government policy is going, to introduce Colin Cook, who's the Deputy Director of Digital Strategy in Scotland. I will lay out some of the highlights.
I'm just telling you to get lost, yes.
Absolutely.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Alright, thank you. It's the or do you need it for that?
No, it's fine.
Fine. It's something over the years you've got to get used to, the fact that people film. There's two things you have to get used to now. The first is the fact that it's filmed. Now that's killed any chance of any joke from any civil servant in any presentation ever, just so you know. Because we really not, I think there's something in the civil service code about not cracking jokes online or something like that. And secondly, of course, you've got to get used to the fact that everyone looks at a screen now, not you. And it took me ages to realise that that wasn't just because I'm incredibly boring. It is because people are writing things or writing notes. Having said that, I hope I can add something to the conference or the meeting today. I think, firstly, a health warning, if I may. I'm not an educator. I'm not even a policy maker in the education environment. But what we thought we'd try and do today, I work in the digital team. I'm responsible for the digital strategy in Scotland. And I thought, what we thought we'd try and do is just give you a little bit of context about how this country is trying to create itself and sustain itself as a world-class digital nation. Because I think it's important that if you're going to engage with government to achieve the kind of aims that we've just heard about, that people understand and can appreciate the context within which we're trying to work. So as I said, I'm not really going to talk much. You've got a whole day, I suspect, talking about education and technology in education, and I'll touch on it a bit, but I'm not really going to talk very much about this. I mean, we do have the Minister here, the Education Minister, Mike Russell, is on record, I think, making some very, very positive noises about the opportunities of technology. He's certainly on record talking about the need for all education institutions to develop, to meet the challenges of technology. And he's also, I believe, on record talking about the potential, and how encouraged he is about the potential of MOOCs and other things to both, well, in particular to get messages across, but also to widen participation and widen access into the pathway of higher education. So I think from an education context, all the messages are going in the kind of direction that this organisation wants to see, and obviously Joe has a very strong role in that, we're very pleased and encouraging to see this. So what I want to do now is just try and, I'll come back to some education things, but really just talk more generally about digital in Scotland. And the first thing to say, and this is a kind of quick advert for our own department, but I think it's important when it comes to engaging with us. We're in a very unique and I think very strong position in Scotland because digital, as you all know, touches everything. There's nothing that can't be digital. But we're lucky in that we have a single digital directorate, a single digital department within the Scottish Government that is able to pull together various strands. Different portfolios, infrastructure, education, and a few others, and building a range of external partnerships. And what it's all about, and the kind of, this is how we talk about the challenge of digital in Scotland. And I think also there's a hook here, and I'll come back to this. It's about creating what we describe as a world-class digital in Scotland. It's a rhetoric that you will hear obviously in terms of universities and the creation of world-class universities. I think it's important that as you develop your thinking, world-class schools, world-class further education, one starts to use the same sort of nomenclature and influence that direction of travel. Give a quick update on where we are and the progress that we've been making with Scotland's broader digital strategy. First, I have to say, it tends to dominate my post bag, and I tend to talk more about connectivity than anything else, because that is still probably the greatest sort of public interest across the country, and it's quite a pleasure not to have to measure on that today. But we are making very, very good progress in Scotland in terms of rolling out the kind of infrastructure that we're going to need to sustain some of these ambitions and some of the ambitions that you have for education. So we have a next generation fibre broadband project which will reach 85% of the premises by the end of 2015 and 95% by the end of 2070, and we will go beyond that with new money that's coming in from various sources. We have a rural broadband team called Community Broadband Scotland, whose explicit role is to work with communities who lie beyond that footprint, who are in the 5%, and to develop community-based solutions with them. Because it's really, Joe already mentioned participation and making sure that people aren't excluded. Well, this is about ensuring that it's not a connectivity reason that people are excluded. And then beyond that, we have further plans to really deliver world-class connectivity in Scotland by 2020. And that's about going anywhere at any time and using any device. We still have challenges in this country, and particularly around mobile coverage, as many of you will probably know. And that's got to be, and is our next focus, but that's going to require different ways of the public sector investing and making sure that, that mobile and Wi-Fi technologies allow us, as I say, to go anywhere, anytime, and use any device by 2020. There are 4 elements. Connectivity is represented by that swooshing thing. I think I've been in 5 different countries now, and I've seen the same swooshing picture. So someone, I hope, is getting good royalty from it. On the right-hand side, digital public services. I'll come back a little bit to this in the context of open data and some of the things that I think that might be relevant to today's discussion. But our aim, we don't tend to use the terminology digital by default that was mentioned earlier by Joe. It's certainly digital first or digital by desire, a determination to offer public services in Scotland that are wanted and welcomed and are very user-friendly. And our focus, Joe was talking about focus on the user. We'll certainly focus on the user in the delivery and development of digital public services. And again, we're making good progress with that in terms of making all services accessible in a single, through a single portal in Scotland, and more importantly perhaps, making sure that services as they're developed across the public sector are done to similar common standards and a commitment to being open in the development of those services. 2 down the bottom, I will spend a little bit longer if I may. This is meant to represent digital participation. I would love someone to tell me a better photograph to never satisfied with the picture that I have for digital participation. But Scottish Government recognises absolutely explicitly that, and it's just recently published a digital participation strategy that says this, with digital participation provides an opportunity to challenge some of the really fundamental ingrained inequalities in our society. And if we're not careful, digital inequality will reinforce those fundamental inequalities in our society. And that's what the strategy is about, making sure that that doesn't happen. So there's a commitment to try and build levels, starting with basic digital literacy, and then building from that a pathway through to some of the more advanced digital skills that are required at the top end of the pyramid, if you could, or pathway, to really get behind the digital economy and build digital businesses and add value to society. But starting with basic digital literacy, and throughout that pathway, having the kind of formal accreditation that Joe and others can bring to the party. And we hope that that whole pathway will eventually be linked to an SQA framework. And certainly, we hope that the basic skills and the basic training will be done. We try and drive that work forward through a thing called the Digital Participation Charter in Scotland. And that's an organisation or a movement that's been around for a couple of years now and tries to encourage organisations of any type, and we really would welcome membership from across the academic sector because we're fairly poorly represented within charter membership at the moment from our leading colleges and universities. Organisations of any type to say 2 things. people, then we're in a much stronger position to go forward. The other element of this strategy I think is worth noting is there's a determination to use a variety of different settings to get the messages across and to get basic digital training and support in place. So that can be community settings, it can be networks of volunteers from within the public, private, third sector. It can be third sector organisations who we do think have a huge and leading role to play here because of the trust they have with many of the people who are currently digitally excluded. I didn't say, but I mean, I think most of you can guess probably who are the digitally excluded. They're older people, they're people on low incomes, they're people living in social housing. They are people who are disadvantaged in many other ways, in other words. So there's a whole network of things, and we're hoping to build a network of Digital Scotland centres where people can actually go and get assistance and support in getting online. And many of these exist already, and many of them are in libraries, but hopefully many more will be in different types of community settings. And Joe mentioned it, I think there's a huge and important role for statutory services such as community learning to be involved in that process. And then finally, the light blue picture on the end is meant to represent Scotland's commitment to supporting and developing the digital economy in Scotland. Two parts to that. Firstly, to get businesses of all types to embrace digital technology, to use it for marketing, for procurement, for other forms of trading. But secondly, to recognise that actually Scotland has already a very vibrant digital ICT sector, and that needs supporting and bolstering as we go forward. One of the great developments as far as for Scotland's digital strategy over the last few years is a recognition within a number of government documents that the digital ICT sector in Scotland has unique strengths and is one of the sectors that will be critical to the future of this country's economic future of this country. And so it takes its place alongside sectors that you would expect, tourism or oil and gas, renewables, and it's now very much at the top table of economic thinking. That's going to require a number of things, and particularly it's going to require a lot of effort in terms of digital skills and digital training. Our sector may be very successful. We do have some huge strengths in things like digital health and the use of data and the like. But like a lot of digital organisations and companies, indeed like government, we're struggling to find people we need to work within that industry to really take it forward. There are a huge number of job opportunities within the digital ICT sector, and we've recognised this recently with the publication of a skills plan, a digital and ICT skills plan by Skills Development Scotland, which looks to engage industry in particular in filling those gaps. And I think that's a really important development for us. Firstly, it looks at the education system as a whole and says, this is a long-term structural problem, and it has to start with how we teach not only computer science, obviously that is part of it, but also other subjects within schools, and to really get people to recognise that new technology is absolutely part of almost any subject now in Scotland, particularly if you're going to go on and study it at a higher level. So it's very much within the education sector. But it's also about working more explicitly with industry and getting industry to examine, firstly to examine and to identify where the gaps are, and secondly to take a role in the delivery of those training courses that we require. And one of the commitments in there is the development of a digital skills academy in Scotland within the next, hopefully within the next 12 to 18 months, which will target some of the immediate skills gaps and put training courses in place to deal with those. Now, how that comes about, what mechanisms we use to deliver those trainings, very much up for debate and up for discussion, and it may be something that you can look at today. So if that's the digital strategy, I just thought I'd pull out a few things that may provide some context for your discussions later on. If I misjudge them, I've misjudged them, but hopefully they do. The first is government has a determination to drive forward digital transformation across the public sector. I mean, anybody in any sector the economy. And I've worked in industries over the last couple of years, like recruitment, and I actually even worked for Royal Mail, which is probably one of the most explicit organisations where new technology came across and changed the entire business model. Anybody working in any organisation will realise that digital technology is transforming the way in which we do business. And the Scottish Government is committed to driving digital transformation across the public sector and using digital technology to try and bring about some of the long-held ambitions that we have for things like the better integration of health and social care, for example. Digital really does, if it's used properly, applied properly, understood properly, have the opportunity to drive forward some of those huge policy commitments of the Scottish Government. So there is a commitment that people like yourselves who are trying to do things in new and different ways, there's a real commitment to work with you on those kind of things. The second bit of context, I said in terms of digital participation, there's a focus on, it says there is a focus on learning and not just assistance. There's an important strand of thinking around digital participation, the use of digital public services called assisted digital. So when public sector services in particular are put online through a digital by default strategy, if you use the UK government's terminology, then the people doing that are challenged to say, how are you going to assist people to get online? And that's very important, and we will have the same approach in Scotland, but we want to come at it a slightly different direction here, because in the purest sense, you can help someone to get online by doing it for them. I can assist you to use a digital service by sitting in front of the computer myself and dealing with what you're telling me on the telephone. And what we want to try and do here, explicitly, is actually use the opportunity that people need to go online for whatever reason it might be, to help that as a hook to develop digital literacy and digital skills and get into that pathway of learning that I talked about. Third bit of context I've just said. We're not stopping. We don't believe that it's right that we stop just at the development of basic digital skills. Obviously they're important. Obviously they're vital, and in many senses digital literacy mirrors lower levels of conventional literacy. And so some of these things are really difficult nuts to crack. But what we want to do is position that as a pathway of skills, and to try and provide opportunities for people to move up that pathway. And as I said before, right at the very end, to really start to add value to the digital economy in terms of the businesses they create and the ways in which they can change the services that we offer. A fourth thing in terms of context is what I've described there as maximising the use of public assets. I was mentioning that a few of us are immune to the impact of digital on what we do. Well, there are opportunities to use public assets to get across many aspects of the digital strategy. So there will have to be connectivity in remote public sector buildings and schools as part of the sort of Scottish wide area network programme. So there'll have to be connectivity in these places. There are colleges, schools, libraries that offer fantastic settings for digital training and digital skills development if we can get people working in a partnership to do that. And so it's very much a part of trying to see what have we got out there that can help this digital transformation across the sector. And also a commitment to partnership working. A number of those elements of the strategy I talked about are not being taken forward just by government. So the digital participation work, for example, is being led by the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations on our behalf, because we think that they're in a much stronger position to engage with many directly, with trust and credibility, with many of the people who are most in need of support for digital working. The work in promoting the digital economy is being taken forward in partnership with Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Business Gateway. The connectivity programme that I referenced right at the beginning is a joint piece of work between national government and local government. So it is not something that can just be done by one organisation. And there is a commitment on all aspects of the digital strategy to work in partnership. And I think it's important as you develop your strategies for how you take this forward to realise that there's very much a willingness and an openness to engage in that way. I mentioned data very briefly. We do think that the use of data and the wider use of data is absolutely critical to the long-term vision of delivering effective public services in Scotland. And we do have a vision of a sort of 2020 vision, if I can call that, of citizens feeling very comfortable about the way in which their personal data is being shared, because it's being shared responsibly, that people know how to access their data. Certainly they know how to access the personal information that's held about them, that data is leveraged to deliver public services, and that when we use it for research, that safeguards are in place in order to protect people and build that confidence. So there is a real focus within the Scottish public sector on the use of data and working together to develop a data vision. Last three, if I may, just briefly. I mentioned the importance of the digital ICT sector, and I think it is critical to the future of the Scottish economy. And the reason it's up there in terms of context for your work today is that we are looking at a government to find opportunities to stimulate new ideas and new businesses and encourage people working in universities like this one, or actually, let's be more specific, working in buildings like this one, to develop new business opportunities when they're at college and when they leave. So we have an outstanding record already in terms of business startups. This university has a particularly outstanding record in terms of business startups. But what we're trying to do is use the wider digital strategy, use the fact that we're having to transform digital services to provide opportunities and ideas for businesses to get on board with. So if it can be done in that way, it's very much the kind of context in which we want to work. I was going to talk about Glow, but I understand that it's on the agenda and someone with far better knowledge of the subject than me, Glow being our sort of nationwide online learning environment. I think it's just an example of how we are, all I'll say is I think it's just an example of how we're prepared to develop and invest in providing a safe online environment for school children and schools to work in. And we do see it very, very much as part of our future commitment to supporting and sponsoring the development of technical skills in schools. And it has its challenges, and I'm sure they'll be explored today, and we have to make sure that children who grow up using the Glow environment, the protected environment, are well equipped to move into the world of work in those areas where perhaps the environment is going to be slightly different. But that's this afternoon. And then finally, I just wanted to reiterate the point. We have a policy commitment to build a world-class digital Scotland. And we're really keen to work with partners who can do things in the digital space which can be considered world-class. Because we're trying to find ways of illustrating that Scotland is actually open to ideas and is open to investment in digital technology. So we've done a number of connectivity pilots working with people who are prepared to test their technology in Scotland. We've just launched an internet exchange for Scotland. It's all about positioning Scotland as a place which really gets the digital world. I think if you can come with those kind of ideas and that kind of commitments through Joe and others, then there's a really welcome for that discussion and an opportunity to take it forward. So hopefully that set a little bit of context about where government policy on digital is, and leave you for the rest of the day to focus down more explicitly on the challenges of education. So thank you very much. I was going to press the delete button, that probably wasn't it.
So that's the high level picture. I don't know what's happening where we're getting a double act or a triple act, but in a way, again, actually, for some of us don't know how policy works. Policy, call this is policy up there. The minister then writes a letter of guidance to the funding council, and then the funding council translate that into policy. So as if by magic, use David and Ronnie to chat about funding council in this space.
Thank you very much, Joe. Good morning, everyone. And it is exactly as Joe describes. That is the policy process. We're going to talk a bit more about that. Great. Okay, so we've got half an hour with me and Ronnie. We thought, when we discussed it, we'd like to spend most of that time having a discussion with you to give you a chance to input your ideas on how you as a network, as a community, can engage with a new piece of work that the Funding Council is involved in with the Open University around open educational practices. But before we get to that, I'm obliged to give the Funding Council update as a kind of policy context, so I'll do that as quickly as I can. And I think the first thing to say is that very noticeably the learning technology agenda is very high in policy making circles at the moment, both within the Funding Council, government, and I think more widely. And Joe said at the beginning this morning, sometimes the tiller is very small. Well, I imagine the reason it's got a high profile is perhaps because of the lot of people in this room and the work that you have been doing to kind of knock on doors and so on. So well done for that. We've seen questions about this in the Scottish Parliament. There has been a mention of learning technology in MOOCs in the letter of guidance from the Cabinet Secretary. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Funding Council had a whole meeting, a whole day, just on the topic of learning and teaching, which got us into learning technology, MOOCs, and all those things. That workshop was something quite new for the Scottish Funding Council. We're used to a format where people like me present with proposals that they have to agree to and that kind of thing. And what we try to do is give the Council a bit more space to focus quite deeply on broad sort of thematic issues. So really to get a whole day just to talk about the status of quality learning and teaching, how students are learning, was really good. And we had inputs from the Quality Assurance Agency, Education Scotland, from a student talking about her experience, and from many academics and universities, including Martin Bean. Martin Bean from the Open University is the Vice-Chancellor there, who came in by video conference. And those of you who know Martin will know the power with which he makes his points around openness, around the kind of work that the Open University does. So those messages were really heard very strongly by the Funding Council on that day. It wasn't, as I say, a meeting where I was taking proposals and there's any specific decisions being made, but I think it was really useful for the Council to get back up to speed with this agenda, the realities of learning and teaching today and the possibilities afforded by technology of where it could develop in the next few years. So what does the Funding Council do? Well, we fund stuff, and still in this space, the biggest thing we're funding is JISC, and I thought I'd just remind ourselves of the kind of things JISC has been doing on the open agenda for many years. Certainly around infrastructure, institutional repositories for research outputs and other things, around open standards for those things. JISC also has a collection of resources available through Jorum, and now Open Jorum. It's done a lot of work on open access publishing and so on, and research data management, and supporting that with practices around the Digital Curation Centre, and they're advising people on RDM strategies and those kinds of things. There's been other work undertaken by the RC in Scotland around open badges, and I suppose it's a new JISC. JISC has just kind of recreated itself. It's no longer a creature of funding bodies. But if you've had a look at the JISC website recently, it's got 10 impact areas that will be governing its strategic efforts over the next few years, and one of them is around the open agenda. Now at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a lot more detail in the box around what JISC is planning to do on the open agenda. I would imagine there's going to be a fair degree of continuity from the fairly broad support that JISC has given to this agenda, just looking at what it's done in the past. So one last point to make about JISC today, as I say, it is now a company. It belongs to the institutions. It's no longer a committee of the funding bodies, and that's quite important in governance terms, because you, as the members of JISC, are really going to have to drive what JISC does. So I guess what I'm trying to get across to you today is there is that commitment to the open agenda from JISC. And I think it's up to everyone in this room to let JISC know what we would like them to do on this side. JISC is now a cost-sharing group, and if you want to avoid paying VAT on JISC services, please make sure your institution is a member of JISC by the 1st of August. I just say that because I know the letters go out to all universities and colleges in Scotland, and sometimes these letters get lost. So if you're not sure whether your institution has signed up, please chase up the letter. It'll be on the principal's desk somewhere, and make sure your institution joins JISC by the 1st of August if you want to avoid paying VAT on services. Okay. So I mentioned the letter of guidance to the Funding Council from the Cabinet Secretary last year. The letter of guidance is in a couple of different sections, and this piece came up in the university section specifically. And it talked about open learning resources and the power of delivering things online. And it specifically asked the Funding Council to take forward a short-term project to further develop and enhance the sector's capacity in online pedagogy. So quite a specific thing we were being asked to do. Around about the same time we got that letter, we were having a discussion with the Open University in Scotland. They put in a proposal essentially to try and leverage, to share some of the work, some of the knowledge they've had through working on future learning and that kind of thing with the rest of the sector. So that proposal had come in. In parallel with that, individual universities had approached us for things that they wanted to do around MOOCs, open education and so on. So then we got the Minister's letter of guidance. We thought, well, let's put all that together. We got a small number of universities in the room, Edinburgh, Glasgow, UU. We said, can we use the Open University's proposal as a basis for something that would engage the whole sector and respond to the challenge that the Minister's put down? So that's where we got to. We've just agreed at the beginning of this year funding for that project. It's 1.27 million over 3 years. Sounds like a lot of money. If you break it down by years, it's not massive amounts of money, but it's still a significant investment. And what I'd like to do in the rest of the session is just tell you a wee bit more about the project, and then with Ronnie kind of open up for discussion, because this is fairly early days for this project. What I'm going to show you next is what was in the bid in terms of the 8 outputs from this work. And I think these are fairly high level and still at a stage where they could be shaped by what we all want to get out of this project. And it is a project, as I say, that's about primarily universities but also colleges in Scotland, and so we'd really be interested in your views. Okay, so now for the risky bit where I give you my opinion on what I think. These will look quite sort of meant to represent, and then Ronnie will no doubt correct me if I get them wrong. So the first one is...
the other way around.
Hi. I should say Ronnie was actually responsible for writing this bit, so I'm glad he's here today to keep me straight on this. Okay, so the first one is a review of current educational practices, what's going on, who's currently involved in doing MOOCs and other kinds of things. And secondly, an events programme, and this is where we start to share learning, share practice. This will have guest speakers and all the usual things, but what are the kinds of topics that you would be interested in that would really help you in your own practice? There will be an online hub. Obviously some people are currently involved in Future Learn. That's not a space that everyone can be involved in. It does have a particular kind of focus. It is a lot about branding and particular kind of markets for learning. So for those institutions who can be involved in Future Learn for whatever reason, this will be a hub where materials can be deployed. You can learn things on that platform. The fourth one, well, this is not a project which will be about developing lots of stuff. It's not about creating loads and loads of learning materials, but we did want to see some worked examples. So the project will produce a small number of open educational resources that are of relevance to Scotland, that deal with real world problems we have in Scotland. And at last year's Open Scotland Summit we did touch on this. You know, what would be the problems that MOOCs are going to solve for us in Scotland? Why would they be worth investing in? What new things are they going to enable us to do? So the kind of things those OERs might be looking at in Scotland is dealing with issues of rurality, which we have in Scotland. Transitions might be another one. Joe mentioned earlier on curriculum for excellence. Big new change in schools. To what extent are colleges and universities on the same page as learners come from schools with curriculum for excellence on the mind? What are the things we can do using OERs that make that transition easier? Now the next one could be about badging of informal learning. People have done bits of learning either on MOOCs or in other places, and how that's accredited. I think reading the bid, there's also a space here that's maybe around kite marking of institutions quality improving resources that's recognised. So probably about those two things. Sixth one, learning design. As Colin was saying earlier, we've got challenges to do with people being digitally excluded and maybe excluded and challenged in other ways. To what extent can curriculum design really help overcome some of these barriers to participation in further and higher education. Research and evaluation, recognising that from Future Learn we have some very good, some big sets of data, learning analytics about people's experiences on that platform. So how can that data, that research data be shared so that everyone in colleges and universities in Scotland, how can they all benefit from that? How can that inform everybody's practice in this space? And finally, economic models. I mean, why are people investing in MOOCs? Particularly, what is the benefit for them? What are other kind of models we should be considering? And new words that cropped up in that context was freemium, which was an entirely new one on me. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a kind of high-level view of the origins of the project, broadly what it's hoping to deliver, and I'll let Ronnie take over just now. I really want to get some feedback from you about shaping that project in a bit more detail.
Thank you. Despite the branding, I actually work for the Open University, not the Branding Council. What I want to I just want to talk briefly, and actually it's more questions really for the room. I really saw this as an opportunity, even though it's a short time, just to sort of open up with some of the questions I had. When I was thinking about what I was going to say, I actually thought about a presentation I'd been to recently, where someone actually did a presentation called What We Talk About When We Talk About iPads. And I'll give you the short version, which is actually we're talking about education, and when we're talking about iPads in the classroom. And it actually comes from a guy, Raymond Carver, short story writer, who built his reputation on writing wonderfully terse and sparse stories. And 20 years later, what came out was actually those wonderfully terse and sparse stories that he built his reputation on were entirely based on the work of teams of editors who actually revised, remixed it. I think you get where I'm going with that metaphor around the importance of actually openness and the ability to revise that. But also, what that story was about was that actually sometimes when we're talking about something, we end up talking about particular things, but actually what we're really talking about is some of the underlying things. When we talk about openness, we quite often talk about the license, because that's one of the things that we see as enabling. Also the technology, we might, as David said, talk a little bit about learning design and about how we actually facilitate those journeys. And quite often when we talk about openness, we talk about who we are and the actual content. At the same time, we also talk about things like platforms and repositories, a place to put things. But as David said, maybe in this project we're not necessarily just talking about repositories and places to put things, because actually there are quite a reasonable amount of repositories now. We talk about metadata, granularity, one of my favourite words, interoperability, especially now that I've learned to say it properly. And we also talk about findability, because these are big challenges. There's a lot of content out there. How do we actually locate it and so on? And sometimes, going back to those economic models, we talk about marketing. Because for many universities, openness is not just about those altruistic motives. There's a little bit of self-interest there. So those are some of the things that we talk about when we talk about open. My feeling is what actually we're really talking about, or what I think I'm really talking about, is teaching and learning, about how we are actually changing the pedagogical practices around the academy. And in particular, what I think we're talking about open is about being open to more people. So actually, online and open licensing, what that has done is generally it's broadened access. More people can access content, but it hasn't always necessarily broadened participation. And that's why one of those outcomes is there about learning design to broaden participation. Because actually we've got to ask ourselves some questions here. Now we've actually got a little bit more maturity about hosting content and thinking about licensing. Is actually we've got to think about who's using that stuff. Because actually I think what I feel we're talking about is actually shifting the balance of power between the academy, what's in the academy and what's outside the academy. To new types of learners, to new types of knowledge production. I did tell David I would pose that as a question rather than a statement. And one of the questions I wanted to ask was around this vision was about how we engage. We have a project here at certain amount of funding. There are some people who are on the steering group and part of the governance structure, but actually, what we've been tasked to do with the Funding Council is create as broad an approach as we possibly can. And that's about actually more than the usual suspects who are in this room today. But obviously we do want to engage with those usual suspects, but we also want to engage with the unusual suspects. And actually, how do we actually do that? And what I'm here today doing is actually asking for your help to try and do that. But also to ask around some of those partnerships that Colin, how do we actually build those kind of partnerships? What structures do we need to put in place in this project to make sure that actually is a partnership between everybody across Scotland who's interested in it? And then I think there's some deeper questions that might come along later in the project about what that shift means, about its pace and sustainability. So those are the questions that I have around. I was hoping that David and I could get some answers from you guys. Yeah, Joe.
The floor's open.
It's not really an answer to the question, but it relates to many questions. It's the thing about the transference of power, if you like, from the academy to a wider audience. I work for an organisation which ranges from people who are really open with what they do and very strong in terms of use of digital technology, through to people who are very face-to-face and quite often closed when you share with their colleagues that part of the world. How much of the challenge do you think is cultural, or how much do we think the challenge is cultural as opposed to technological, or even financial, which is probably in the middle of the two? I think it's relationship to culture, but it's that cultural challenge. I mean, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, that's the hearts and minds thing, isn't it, around actually how we change those cultures and practices within institutions. I don't know. I mean, I think that is the key challenge, and the question we're asking today is how do we meet that challenge? On the face of it, one might say it's about events and raising awareness and so on, but that actually just creates a space, and people only go into that space and join in that space if they're actually going slightly in that direction anyway. So what are the levers or the drivers that would actually make people enter that? And that's a good question.
I think looking at the economic models is helpful there because, well, we all know that technology hasn't been a barrier, but I think some people's preoccupation with I can make lots of money out of these learning materials, and that really seems to happen, but that mindset seems to be a barrier to it. So I think that last point about the economic models and why we're doing things in a certain way, that there can be a payback by releasing something freely and you get payback somewhere else in the institution. If that could be established, then I think you give people a rationale and it takes away some of that protectionist mindset.
I'll check. Well, I've got any more, by the way.
Two quick questions, please. Suzanne Ball, Director of Jordan, mentioned that there are a number of repositories out there. I was wondering how the project is going to work with Jordan, if at all. And then my second question is, you have aligned yourself with a number of universities, but given your articulation pass with Glasgow and Edinburgh, from FE to HE, how are you going to work with other education colleges?
Okay, I'll pick up one on Durham. Yes, we're in conversations with Durham. We don't see I personally, and I'm speaking personally, and it is early days, I personally don't see the purpose of any hub to be about creating repositories. There are many repositories that have different affordances and can do different things for different people. And I think that what we would be doing would be actually helping and directing people to the appropriate repositories for their needs, including Durham.
Yeah, who are you speaking to at Jordan?
I can't remember. Someone at Manchester? I can't, sorry.
I'm the director of Jordan in Manchester. You're not speaking to me.
I'm sorry, I can't remember. I've had
Second part, Jordan, other education colleges, how they would work with FE?
Yeah, well, some of you will be aware of the resource platform that colleagues at College Development Network developed. That's had quite a long gestation period, and I guess we want to see how that might be used in practice, and that's definitely one of the one of the target repositories on the list. On articulation, I know that one of the barriers to articulation is when universities and colleges don't see an alignment between their curricular offerings, and so there must be a space for bridging materials and things of that kind to at least address that issue in articulation. There are, of course, other issues around articulation and people's appetite for that, but at least perhaps we can address the issue of curricular alignment through these kind of practices. And it's certainly a very topical issue in Scottish education, and we must address issues which are very relevant to Scotland, so thanks for raising that.
Just following on from that point, we have from the previous discussion that what we were interested in from Scotland was trying to involve the students that are underrepresented. And one statistic, the universities that are involved are the ones not particularly in that area get students from deprived areas.
Can I just pick up on that from the OU perspective? I think that people at the OU would be quite upset if it's characterised as a university that wasn't actually good at drawing in students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think that people like Gary at the UHI probably would as well. But I think that you're right to highlight that there are some institutions who are on the steering group who are not necessarily always being as engaged in broadening the socio-economic place of those who access education. And we know within the open education movement as well that in general the people who are accessing free resources are the educational haves rather than the educational have-nots. And that's why we've actually got it as a key outcome, is to actually explore what that means, what non-participation means. Is it about that the content is not relevant? Is it actually something about the pedagogical design and our particular approach? I mean, some of the things that we're working with at Open University are actually thinking about how we actually embed these open educational resources and practices within partnership works we're doing with third sector organisations, like with refugees and asylum seekers, with carers organisations, and so on. So actually looking at alternative pedagogical models that are embedded within trusted communities of practice that people who are marginalised from education can go to. And so I think there's, within that, there's actually, there's a whole bunch of different approaches, and I think that's why it's a key thing for the project. And quite often when you see an objection to the project, it doesn't, it's about institutions learning from each other, and not everybody's going to be as good as widening participation as the others.
Yeah, I suppose I'd also put in the word for Glasgow. A lot of the work they've done for their widening access students has found it worked so well in improving their achievement that they've rolled out those practices to their whole undergraduate student body, and that's really worked for them. But let's face it, that we have a collection of universities, they have different profiles of recruitment and different missions. The core thing about this project is we have established a small group to manage the project. What we're trying to do here is make sure it's a project that's going to reach everyone, and that's why we're giving you a chance to try and put to the project objectives today. So it will be something that has to follow the whole sector.
Hi, just picking up the point before about the participation, particularly in books. I know the headline figures are very much that most people doing it already have a degree or a higher degree. But actually, it's not quite a significant number who don't. I'm just looking at some stats from FutureLearn, where it's talking about education. 60% have got a degree, 22% have got a master's, but 18% are only secondary. And I think we've got to be careful that we don't just write it off as it's only people with a private degree that are actually participating. There's a big chunk there. It would be quite interesting to find out who that chunk is, what they're doing, why, where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say that in terms of the profile of people who use Open University's Open Learn platform, depending on which audience I'm speaking to, sometimes what I highlight is that 2/3 have at least a degree. Sometimes I might highlight that 1/3 just have high school.
It also might be interesting to find out whether that chunk actually sustain their engagement with books better than people who read or worse.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think that there's some data from Coursera that shows actually that more people with PhDs don't finish the MOOCs than finish them.
I'd just like to explore the word you got on the screen there sustainability and the role that that's going to play in the project, because I think, I know you were at the recent Open Courseware Consortium conference in Vienna, and I think there's a lot of evidence that shows to really make the most of open education, you have to start with staff development and building capacity in the sector, and I think you really have to dedicate resource there to enable to really get the kind of benefits and affordances that we've just we've heard about this morning. And I think there is a bit of we're at a sort of quite a delicate situation at the moment where funding is increasingly short term, and there's a real danger of losing capacity in the sector of the very people who have the expertise to enable the support of developing online pedagogies and online education. So I think that's going to be crucially important to take into account, particularly in looking at the economic models. It's not just about how you persuade staff to open access to their resources or teach more MOOCs. It's about how do you support the people who have the expertise already in the sector to ensure we don't lose them from Scotland, because I think there's a real danger there that we're losing the very people that can actually make these changes happen.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about how it relates to the core business model of the university.
And not just universities, but the other organisations as well.
Yeah, I've had some interesting discussions with third sector organisations about that quite often get a lot of data from the people they work with, and actually they would like to give that data to people for nothing, but they're also wondering about the commercial value of that data. And it's actually, because they've got a social mission there, and it's actually how you maintain your social mission while also commercial, actually sustaining it within your business. It's a big question.
Can I put a question, or just a thing? I think there's something in this though. I think fundamentally how all of this is driven is by what I would call the open professional. Whether that's the FE lecturer, the university lecturer, the school teacher, the adult learning continuing, wherever that tutor is working. If they're not willing to engage in open and sharing, then it's not going to happen. But they're only able to engage in open sharing if their institution understands open. And I think a strand of this should be looking at practice and policy around what an open institution is. And that doesn't mean that you're giving away all your crown jewels, because there will still be some content and various other things you say, no, for specialist purposes, we're going to invest money in this specialist content for this specialist audience that gives us an advantage in whatever the latest technology is or whatever. But even when they do that, and it's public money, I think you should only be able to hold that for 2 or 3 years, and then that should come up. But the rest of the things that we do mostly, and I'm speaking as an English and history teacher and all these kind of things, I should be able to give all of that away, and my institution should be encouraging me to give all of that away. And that's not sophisticated learning objects and things. Again, I think in all of this, let's also not kid ourselves on that when we open all of this up, suddenly there's going to be this wealth of fantastic learning materials that will put publishers out of business. It's not. Publishers will still do all that specialist stuff, and institutions will still create wonderfully rich, fantastic OERs. But actually, to reach more learners, you need to think about the open professional and how you get institutions to think about what their open policies are in terms. And I think that should be a strand about that kind of practice and policy of an open institution. And if you get that right, then that would be good for universities and colleges, but it's something that needs to cascade down into the school system too.
Maybe we need a vision workshop about what an open institution might look like.
Yeah. And what an open professional might be, what professional practice you might be. If you're doing your General Teaching Council qualification or your TQFE or what is your practice in that open? Sorry, I didn't mean to hold the floor. Is that a question back?
I think just a follow-on comment. I think the open practitioner is a really key ingredient. But I think what's also a key ingredient, what Joe is hinting at, is the support for the open practitioner. Because we can't expect people to be effective open practitioners if we don't actually provide them with support. And I think particularly in FE, there's a really strong case to be made for very, very strong support for teachers in using technologies There's so much innovation going on, so much sort of people out of their own back with their own gadgets, trying new things, helping learners, and that's fantastic. But to have, you know, to be able to scale up that change, I think the scale only comes with the support. And that is, I think, something that, you know, we as sectors or communities haven't been very successful in putting in place. So I think that's something that's really important.
Okay, one change to the
I'm Kerry Gavin at Glasgow University. One of the things we've been involved in recently are the books with FutureLearn, and what that's quite interesting for me out of that is that in developing material for online, you've really got to think about openness because it's so much easier. But we've also had challenges with that. For example, one of the courses we're doing just now is like genomics, and a lot of the images are specialist, so and they come from developing trusts. So you've got a whole lot of like issues right around copyright, ownership, licensing. And the challenge there is it's not that you can go out and get these images elsewhere, they're actually created using special techniques, special machinery. So you can't just say that one's copyright, I'll use a different one. And I think there's still quite a lot of challenges around that area, particularly for certain areas of study.
Just get the question back, you know.
Joe's just posed this question, you know, what is an open institution, which could have a lovely set of in terms of...
I've written it down.
And I'm sure you'll do it. In terms of openness and developing an open institution, clearly there needs to be a commitment from managers, from the top professionals in the organisation. I'd like to ask, I noticed that the Scottish Government representatives left to deliver this speech. I'd like to ask you, what do you think the role of government, the Scottish Government, should be in developing open institutions? And David, what's the role of the funding council?
I'll probably just speak on one of those. Well, I think we have a responsibility to the higher and further education sectors in Scotland. We have a good set of institutions. It looks very different from England. We don't have big influence of private providers and so on. But I think we do have a responsibility to make sure that sector is sustainable in terms of staying relevant in terms of its offering. Because in the kind of space we're talking about, how long will it be before we're getting loss of market share of our own students to some of these international providers? So we have to be nimble, we have to be up for the challenge of responding to that, and I think there are various reasons that we think we might be able to lead on some of these issues. We are quite small, but we have good branding and a lot of expertise. So I think when people talk about MOOCs being a disruptive technology, we might have new kinds of institutions, or it might be, as Joe was saying, there's an open bit to the institution which helps deal with some of these aspects. You know, maybe it's wider participation and that's a new thing for the institution. On the back of that, they're increasing the market share and it makes business sense for them to do that for other reasons, whilst continuing with a predominantly campus-based education offering, which, you know, is still in big demand in Scotland. So that may be the thing that enables us to continue doing a lot of the things that we want to do. So it's not like it destroys the institution, it enables it to carry on but in new ways. So I think from the council's point of view, that's our responsibility through the quality assurance agencies and so on, to make sure that we're staying up to date in terms of practice, and this is, I think, a big part of that. From the government's point of view, they've set out their digital strategy, and we, in the Funding Council, we have a group which looks at how that strategy plays out in our sector. At the moment, the emphasis has been very much on infrastructure, and we talked about the network and some of the enabling things. As we get to some of the issues of practice and how people engage with public services and education, I think that becomes a more interesting discussion. And I think it's early days what the government's expectations of how this is going to transform university education. Certainly MOOCs and things like that have dominated the kind of policy rhetoric. And I go to meetings and people go, oh God, you know, it's not just about MOOCs. I think that's understood. MOOCs is the first thing here, but behind that there's issues of pedagogy, issues of the open philosophy are always there.
One more question.
Just a quick comment. I don't know if everyone's aware of this, but there has been a letter sent to principals of all universities in Scotland, I believe, from one of the MSPs who sits in the Education Committee, specifically asking us what we're currently doing in open and distance education. So it'd be really useful, perhaps, to for the project steering group to find out what the results of that are and how that information is going to be used. Because I just know, because I've been asked to draft response from our universities, I'm sure everybody else will have something similar. But the other point is just a general one. Excuse me, about the project. I think it's really welcome, it's timely. However, you probably picked up, I think there's some resentment among the community about how it was set up, and a feeling that it perhaps wasn't open itself, it wasn't transparent in the way it was dealt with in terms of involving a range of institutions at different sectors.
Well, I'm aware of that, Linda, and I do take that point. What I'm trying to set out today was basically how we came to where we got to. And in that initial meeting we had with our partners, it was very much with the way of designing something that was going to engage everyone. And I think we're not too far down the line to come up with an agenda and a set of actions that will be of value to everyone. Necessarily, we have to have a conversation with a small group of people and then open it up. That's obviously the way these things happen. So I'm sorry that's not gone down well in some quarters. I think it's still a project here which if we all engage with it, will deliver things that are of use to everybody, and I hope people will engage in that spirit.
Okay, all right, thanks. Ronnie and David will be with us over lunch, and I think there's still. I mean, this is a dialogue about this open space, and I think the really good news is here's the Scottish Government and the Federal Council pushing money into this open space, and you've got a chance to shape it. So make sure you bring the views over lunchtime. Thanks very much, Ronnie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Incentivising learning. So without further ado, Susanna Scott, so go.
Good afternoon everyone, and I'm here as a kind of light relief before lunch, I hope. So this is really just about our very practical journey through open badges at Borders College. I'm going to apologise because I wasn't sure if everybody knew about open badges or not, but I'm guessing most people do, so I apologise if we kind of preach it and converted. I'll just do a very quick intro of what they are and what they look like, but then focus more on how we're using them at Borders College. I always think that the best way to talk about open badges is to remind people of when they were brownies or cubs, because people can always relate to that. So, is there anybody in the room who didn't have a badge as a brownie or a cub when they were little? My goodness, what were you all doing with your lives? Most people can relate to this because, and I have to say, no sexist comments meant here, but most women always remember that moment when they got the hostess badge as a brownie. It was like the ultimate goal in life was to make a cup of tea without scalding yourself. So that's what most people can relate back to, but badges have existed in this form for a long time, and open badges are obviously just a kind of updated version of this. Supported by Mozilla, a visual representation of something that you've achieved, with obviously metadata hard-coded into it to actually explain what's the reason for having been awarded that badge. So the image is there, there's various data behind it, it's issued by an organisation and then hopefully endorsed by someone else to give it extra credibility. They generally are hosted in a backpack, which is again an independent resource posted by Mozilla, that can then be pushed out to various locations, although Shalane and I were having this conversation just before we came in about the fact that as yet they're not really being pushed out to other places, they're kind of being hidden away, and it's one of the steps that we need to track is how we actually get them pushed out and displayed in different places. So the idea behind the badge is that obviously there's the name, description, the criteria, which is one of the most important things, and also other elements. One of the things that interests me most about badges and kind of the future steps of badges is around this evidence element. I think there's huge scope to start linking proper evidence into badges and kind of using that to kind of give it more value. So if you're issuing a badge that shows that you can create a short film, why can't you link that and show people the film so that they actually see it rather than you telling them that you can do it? And I think again that's one of the areas that I'm keen to kind of look into. It's just a screenshot from my backpack, again showing how badges can be displayed and how they're shown. Like I say, I'll just kind of skip through this because I appreciate that most people will know all about this. In terms of our journey at Borders College, I really just want to kind of go through the various steps we've gone through in this journey, and it has been a kind of in and out. It's been a kind of long journey and we've touched on various elements, so we tried to get them into the curriculum right away. Then we had to kind of step back from that. Then we issued Moodle badges because we were in control of that. We then started issuing CPD badges. We're now working with local employers, and thankfully we're back round to starting to get them into the curriculum. So I'm just going to kind of talk about what we've learned as we went through this process. The first encounter I ever had with open badges was in June 2012 at the ALT Scotland annual conference. And Doug Belshaw was presenting on open badges, and I have to say it was like this huge light bulb going on in my head. Having taught computing as a lecturer for a number of years, there was always loads of areas that weren't really accredited within the curriculum. So, for example, at Borders we were replacing some of the kind of standard assessments with more creative approaches. So instead of writing an essay, we were getting them to create a podcast. Instead of submitting a report, they were creating a short film. We couldn't acknowledge that in any way. All we could say is you've ticked Creative Industries Unit, we've done that, you've got that, and it was on their transcript, but there was nowhere that said this student actually has a bit more to offer. They don't just have their HNC at the end of the day, they've actually got these additional skills. So that was kind of where we started with this, but it's not been an easy journey. As I said, I was delighted when I heard people speaking. I thought the badges were a great way forward, and I kind of ran back to the Borders, kind of shouting and screaming. And then I got there and I kind of hit this brick wall where there was a lot of concern from senior management about what is this, what does this mean, where are we going with this, is it more assessment, is it more work, how much does it cost us, how much time is it going to take. So all the kind of standard responses that you would expect to kind of new innovation. And I have to say, it was disheartening at the time to think that I couldn't just bring this to the college and run with it, but I didn't give up. So my colleague and myself sat down, we were responsible for teaching HNC Interactive Media at that time, and we could very quickly identify areas that were missing. So, for example, as I said, the podcast and the short films. We also recognised the value of retaining our students through open badges and motivating them. We have students who struggle very much in terms of the fact that a lot of them have maybe dropped out of school or maybe only in college because they have to be there until they're 16 or because their parents have told them that you are doing something. And so you need to keep motivating those students. They are not just going to turn up every day. And they struggle with some of the concepts, particularly in computing, which can generally be a harder subject for them to deal with. Issues such as colour and user interface design, they always struggled with that, and we felt that there was a gap there, that if we could break those subjects down a lot more and sort of acknowledge their learning at every stage, then we would have a better chance of keeping them. So we spent some time kind of scoping out a few badges and the criteria that would be associated with those, and we sort of took that to our middle management and said this is what we want to do. And at this point there was a real kind of hands up as in, we can't do this, this is too difficult, this is too new, we don't know what we're doing, there's too much time involved, there's too much assessment required, why are we over-assessing, why are we assessing things that we're already assessing? So there was a lot of concerns, and this all sounds very negative at this point, but it was just really another step in the process for us. Thankfully we have a technology enhanced learning unit within the college, which has only recently been founded. We're only official as of the 1st of January this year, although we were just funded for the 18 months before that. And so we were able to try some things through the team, which kind of didn't really affect the college in the same way that badges across the curriculum would have. So at this point we decided that we were still going to persevere with open badges, and what we were going to do was issue them from ourselves. So we are responsible for Moodle within the college, so what we decided was we could accredit the students for their digital literacy skills within Moodle, so when they contribute to a discussion forum, when they put up an effective profile picture and things like that. So we ran a very small pilot, really with the aim of introducing badges across the college in a kind of gentle way, and this was one of the first badges we awarded to one of our students, and they were well received by the students. This is just to give you an idea of the badges. We worked on a kind of mini badge and then scaling up to a kind of larger badge. So they had to sort of gather 3 or 4, sometimes 5 mini badges to be awarded the kind of big badge at the end. And it was really just about focusing on their digital literacy, as I said. So it was about discussion forums, about submitting assessments electronically and encouraging them to do more things within the VLE. We also started to recognise the work that the staff put in, because often a lot of our staff put in a lot of their own time to develop really interactive materials within Moodle, and again that's not really recognised. There's no sort of acknowledgement for that work. So we were able to award badges to our staff who've done a good job within Moodle. We also very controversially suggested that our students would be able to award badges to staff. And I have to say it went down like a lead balloon. In fact, I did hear the word union mentioned at one point. My thinking with this was really that, you know, we're still in an environment within an FE institution where our students actually really still reward you at the end of a year. They still bring you a box of chocolates or a bunch of flowers to say thank you for the work that you've done with them. And I kind of thought, you know, rather than putting on weight eating the chocolates, I'd rather have an open badge that actually acknowledged the work that I've done for them. So that was kind of my thinking behind it. Like I say, it didn't go down too well, and I'm desperately looking for somebody in the open badge community across the world that's going to say to me, I'm allowing students to award badges to teachers or to staff, and I want to find a case study that I can kind of use to say that it does work, honest, it's okay. So I think that again just kind of gave me a time to kind of stop and say, you know, just going back to the previous presentation, there is a huge culture shift required to kind of accept all this stuff, and people need time to kind of adjust. It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, that's 2 years we've been working on open badges now, and only now are we kind of getting to the point that people are kind of really aware of them and happy to accept them. Very luckily, I had a chance meeting in the corridor, which is usually where all the best meetings happen, with our head of HR, and she said, I've heard about open badges, what are they? And I explained them to her, and she said, can we have them? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, you know, our paper certificates that we have for CPD sessions, they get lost, they get thrown away, they don't really have any value to people. I want to try and kind of increase the value of our CPD sessions. So we did discuss giving people, so it was a kind of very slow process. They could have a paper certificate or they could have an open badge. But thankfully our head of HR said, no, I'm not doing that, they're just getting a badge. So whether they liked it or not, they were getting an open badge. But we're now at the point where we only award open badges for staff CPD sessions. So every staff CPD session within Borders College is acknowledged with an open badge. And it means that basically every member of staff within Borders College knows what open badges are, which has been really effective because it was a good way of kind of blanket quoting everybody and saying you have to know what these things are. So everybody, hopefully, if you ask anyone at Borders College, they'll know what they are now. And we've also seen kind of increased value in these badges. So before, where people were getting paper certificates and they weren't really sure what the value of this paper certificate was, they see the value in their badge. So the CPD sessions aren't just mandatory anymore. They see that these badges can actually potentially have value outside the organisation. And although the design of the badges did take a long time to start with, we now have a kind of template which you can see where we have associated colours with different types of CPD sessions and things like that, and it's fairly easy now to just change the middle image. Kind of looking back on it, it has been an interesting journey. I'm still glad that I did start on the sort of open badge journey. I think I'm more realistic about what needs to be done. I think I have a much better idea of what's needed. I think I would like to be somebody starting open badges now and telling myself what I know now, but you know. I think sort of working groups with various organisations, just SQA, College Development Network, and other organisations will really help that. We need to make sure that we keep working together to move this forward. Just kind of collating some of my thoughts about what the kind of key points have been in this journey. We have found that the image is important, the design of the image is important. It's not the be-all and end-all. The criteria are obviously the most important thing that add value to it, but it has to be something that people aspire to. People want something that's nice, they want something to collect that they sort of like looking at, that's beautiful. You do have to handle concerns sensitively. I think it's very easy, I'm such a believer in open badges, it's very easy to sort of say, what's the problem? But I've kind of learned over the years that it's not a good way to deal with it. So you have to kind of look for different routes in, and obviously the CPD one was an amazing way to get in for us. Once you get institutional buy-in, it's a much easier route to follow. And that's kind of where we are at the moment in terms of borders. We have just agreed with our senior management team that over the next 3 years we will introduce open badges across the curriculum, which is a huge win for us to get to this point after 2 years of a struggle. So that's really our work, is to work with individual faculties within the curriculum and identify areas where open badges could be introduced. We've got lots and lots of other ideas about where we'd like to go with open badges. We're talking about sort of accrediting prior learning with an open badge. We get a lot of people coming back to college who've been out of education for a long time, who maybe don't have any actual qualifications. We think that you should be able to actually recognise that learning by saying somebody at Borders College can put a wrapper around that learning and give it a badge so that it's got value elsewhere. We also want to try and create pathways for our learners so that, for example, a student who's on a care programme can say, I want to be a nurse, but I also want to be a paediatric nurse, and that we can sort of guide them to a suite of paediatric related badges that would help them to get to that place. And our biggest one recently is that we've actually really started working with local employers. A lot of the feedback we got from the students was it's great to have an open badge, but if it doesn't have any value locally, what good does it do me? So we're working with NHS Borders, which is obviously one of our biggest employers in the region, and we're now piloting open badges for them. When, I say when, not if, when the pilot is successful, we aim to introduce open badges across their CPD for the NHS, and that will be a huge, huge win for us. Again, for every member of staff within the NHS to actually know what an open badge is, and for them to possibly be receiving CVs from our staff, from our students with open badges associated with them, means that we've got an in there already. And we've also started awarding open badges for early and adult placements as well. I think there's just a couple of dependencies just to kind of finish off. I think I was speaking to Joe just a few days ago and I was saying, when the SQ made the announcement last year that it was okay to do open badges, it was a huge kind of win for us. It was somebody saying that this was okay. It wasn't just a passing kind of fad. There was real value in it. It really opened doors, and I think that was the point where our college started saying, okay, actually we're going to take this seriously and really work with it. The work of OBSEG is really, really crucial as well, and we're part of that group. And I think in terms of trying to gather people who are interested in open badges, kind of moving this forward and trying to answer all the questions that we've still got around open badges. Every time I do a presentation on open badges, it's generally the same questions that get answered. I don't think we're much closer at the moment to answering those, and I think the work of OBSEG really has to be about answering those questions, and trying to make the process a lot simpler for people. I always think about, what's the future of open badges and what could we do next. I like the idea of working sort of collectively to create a suite of subject-specific open badges. I think there's much more guidance needed around the tools that are available. There's so many different tools available in terms of open badges. I think people are still trying to work out what do they do, what do they use, which version of a toolkit do they use, which version of a badge maker do they use. And in terms of what I hear, people who are actually creating open badges need a simple process to get them from stage 1 to stage 10 or wherever it is where a badge is issued and displayed. And that doesn't exist at the moment. It's still quite complicated to work out what you need to do that. In my current role, I'm starting to work with the schools. We've had a lot of inquiries around open badges, and so we're starting to work with schools within the next couple of weeks to try and get them issuing badges in the borders as well, and to also work with the students and the pupils to start creating and issuing their own badges. There's always the question around funding and whether there could be more specific projects around open badges, which would always help. Money's always an issue, obviously, and time. And again, I think there's still a big role for us to play in terms of introducing open badges to employers. There's all the information out there about open badges, Digital Maze, Badge Canvas and the Badge Maker project, which are all good tools to kind of start people off. And obviously all the further information is available from JISC and the case studies that are there. If anybody wants to contact me, those are my contact details. I'm always happy to speak to people about our journey, so thank you.
Don't escape, we'll see if there's any questions for Suzanne. Just because open badges, some of us all sit and think, oh, we know a bit about it, but actually, I think it's really interesting to hear. This is the borders getting badged. This is the schools, the NHS, the colleges using them. It's really innovative what's happening here. But I know you've overcome lots of challenges. So I just want question here.
Can I ask from an employer's point of view, what can the students send them? What can they see, say, before an interview?
We haven't worked that out yet. We hope that in the future it'll be a case of sending a CV and then a link to their backpack where they can share specific badges within the backpack, so they can say, I'm applying for this job, I want them to see these badges, I'm applying for this job, I want them to see that. That would be the ideal, that within your CV somewhere that there's a link to the badges, but we haven't worked all that out yet.
Yes, it's almost like a portfolio in a way, isn't it? That you can imagine somebody could look at the badges beforehand, use it as a way of opening discussion with the person.
And I mean, again, I think that's, in relation to the evidence element of badges, again, I would like to think that, certainly we've got Mahara portfolios for our students, which at the moment kind of die almost when they leave. We do export them sometimes to other places, but again, if there's a link to a badge to a real portfolio of work, again, it would be a great starting point for a discussion.
Granny's got a question.
It's not got a question, actually, it's a comment in response to that question. I've been working with Mozilla over the last few months to develop something called Discovery and the Discovery project, which is looking at badges and social employment. So the tool would allow people to actually specify badges to try them in for a particular practice to take employment. So it's proof of concept on the Windows prototype and creative, but that's how we need to
one of the issues that we had talked to employers is that they wanted the university to officially recognise them. That they weren't interested in badges that were just being supplied within a middle context.
I'll just amplify that. One of the challenges the university had was they wanted the university to recognise their badges, and that meant employers were more reluctant to accept them without that university endorsement. So I'll just put it back, couldn't hear it. Another question here?
Suzanne, I wondered if you had any insight into how students and staff are displaying the badges that they earn.
They're only displaying them in Moodle at the moment, so we issue them through Moodle, they're displayed in Moodle, they have a separate area within Moodle now for their badges, but what we do is we issue instructions to them to push them out to their backpacks, so they're in the backpacks. But again, it's a conversation Shalane and I were just having about where do they go with them next, and I think, these are still all the steps that we haven't got to yet almost, we've got badges out there, but every step you do just gives you more questions and more kind of areas to explore, so it's the next step for us.
Question?
Hello, it's from CITES. Just wondering, when you're rolling out badges that are connected to the curriculum, how do you connect it to the curriculum generally, so that, if somebody comes across a badge like that they know that this is a national or part of the national curriculum or a wider curriculum?
In terms of the curriculum, what we're hoping to do is very much just work with lecturers and identify the areas that aren't acknowledged within an SQE qualification, for example. So they'll still have that, it will never disappear, but it would be for the other things, like I say, for maybe volunteering or work placements or things like that kind of don't currently get sort of accredited in the same way.
Is there some kind of link back? Because that would be quite interesting.
It would be great. We've also got challenges. We've got challenges too in how we hold our data. So at the moment, what they might just be linking back to is to a PDF document somewhere. And if the badge is that complement to national qualification, so the badge might just be overtaking a performance criteria or an outcome, it might be a bit misleading to an employer to get a link back to a whole 40-hour unit of learning when in fact the badge is only 10 hours or 5 hours of that. But there is something in that, and it's a challenge in the system about Data sharing, which you're actually an expert with.
That's why I was wondering.
John.
There's a nice piece of work being done in a school, a high school in New Jersey, actually, New Milford High School. The librarian, media specialist there, has set up a WordPress-based site that allows teachers, it's aimed purely at teachers at the moment, for informal CPD, and informal CPD particularly around ICT, digital skills, those kind of areas. The WordPress site is actually open to anybody to use, and it's even free for you to download and use for yourself, rebadge it, format it for yourself. One of the nice things there is that teachers, when they get their badges, actually print them out and display them on their door, classroom door. You can see it.
Any other questions before we close off for lunch? One more?
It's not really a question, but just thinking about this conversation and the discussion about the open educational practices project that we talked about earlier on. One of the outcomes, one of the stated high-level outcomes was about methods for accreditation of informal learning. And it sounds to me like there's a real opportunity here to link that original project or that project to the sort of this open practice and CPD. I think there's a real challenge and opportunity here.
Absolutely. I think all of the what we all lack in we haven't really talked much about open badges in schools, but in colleges and certainly in universities, there might be something of having a platform or even just a methodology of how we all make open badges and where learners store their badges in Scotland. Because at the moment we're all exploring around the edges of this thing, but there's not a clear runway for us to do that. Sorry.
I just really wanted to add the offset group, the Open Badges in Scottish Education group, has a number of subgroups that are looking just at those things, and it's actually comprised of schools, employers, agencies, FE and HE, so it covers the whole draft of people.
And if you're interested, have a look, do a Google for OPSEC and get involved.
Tomorrow.
It's
tomorrow.
Tomorrow. So on that note, Suzanne, will you start again? Thank you. And lunch is served. Thank you.
Yeah, John, listen to this.